James Callahan was holding a bottle of champagne he bought to celebrate the biggest promotion of his career when he opened his own bedroom door and watched his entire life collapse in under 3 seconds. He'd left work early, giddy in a way he hadn't felt in years, practicing in his head exactly how he'd tell Melissa that after 8 years of grinding through late nights and missed vacations, he'd finally made partner. He imagined her face lighting up. He imagined popping that champagne together on their back porch, the way they used to celebrate. Salvatore was 54, a controlling figure in a vast, quiet network of business interests that stretched across shipping, real estate, and a dozen legitimate-looking companies that concealed far more complicated arrangements underneath. He'd built his empire over 3 decades through patience, precision, and a rare talent for identifying exactly the right person for exactly the right leverage at exactly the right moment. For the past several months, Salvatore had been circling a much bigger problem. A corrupt business partnership involving James's own employer, a mid-sized accounting firm that had, unknowingly to most of its staff, been laundering money for a rival criminal network Salvatore had spent years trying to dismantle. He needed someone inside that firm, someone with detailed access to its books, someone respected enough not to be immediately suspected, and crucially, someone with absolutely nothing left to lose. He'd been watching several candidates for weeks. James Callahan had risen to the top of that list not because of the affair. Salvatore had known about Melissa's infidelity for 3 weeks purely as a side effect of routine surveillance on an unrelated matter. That's exactly the kind of thinking he's counting on, Marcus said, leaning forward urgently. You're not thinking clearly tonight, and honestly, nobody would blame you for that after what you just walked in on. But whatever he wants from you, it's going to involve real risk, legal risk, physical risk, or both. I need you to promise me you won't decide anything until you've actually slept, and until we've figured out exactly what inside access to your firm's records is really about. James wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could handle whatever this turned out to be, but some quiet, rational part of him, the same part that had built an entire career on careful, methodical decision-making, recognized that Marcus was right. Okay, James said finally. I'll wait. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. Whatever this turns out to be, I don't think I can just go back to my old life like tonight never happened. That life is already gone. What neither of them knew yet was exactly how right James was, and exactly how much more complicated the reasons behind that were about to become. 3 days after the worst night of his life, James finally returned home, not to reconcile, but to collect his things and have the conversation he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd set that champagne bottle down and walked away without a word. Melissa looked exhausted, guilt written plainly across her face in a way James found almost unbearable to look at directly. Fair, Salvatore said, sounding almost approving of the caution. Your firm handles the books for several companies that appear, on paper, to be entirely legitimate real estate and logistics operations. In reality, a portion of those operations move money for a rival organization I've spent years trying to dismantle. I need detailed documentation, invoices, wire transfer records, internal communications that would allow federal investigators to build an airtight case against that organization without any of it being traceable back to me. You want me to become partner, gain access to those records, and then hand them over to federal investigators, James said slowly, processing the enormous risk embedded in every part of that sentence. That's not a business favor, Salvatore. That's asking me to become a federal informant against dangerous people in exchange for $1 billion. Yes, Salvatore said simply, without a hint of apology in his voice. I'm telling you, Marcus said gently, that I think you need to consider the very real possibility that you didn't just walk in on a betrayal that night, James. I think you might have walked in on the edge of something much bigger, something Salvatore Marchetti already understood far better than you did when he called you an hour later. Here's the revelation that reframes everything about this story. When James finally confronted Salvatore directly about Richard Aldridge's financial troubles and his affair with Melissa, Salvatore didn't act surprised at all. "You already knew," James said, voice tight with a fury he hadn't expected to feel toward the man who'd offered him $1 billion. "You knew Richard was in debt to dangerous people. You knew he'd gotten close to my wife. You might have even known why, before I ever walked through my own bedroom door." Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, there was something almost like respect in his voice. Respect for the fact that James had actually pieced together a puzzle Salvatore hadn't expected him to solve so quickly. "I knew Richard Aldridge owed a considerable debt to the same organization I've spent years trying to dismantle," Salvatore admitted. "I knew he'd been pressured to find ways to make himself useful to them in exchange for more time to pay it back." "I know that," James said. "But Marcus, what's the alternative? I go back to being an accountant at a firm run partly by a man who let dangerous people use my own household as leverage? I pretend none of this happened, take my promotion, and hope nobody ever asks me to look too closely at the accounts I'll suddenly have full access to." Marcus didn't have a good answer for that, because James was right. There wasn't a version of staying silent that actually protected him from the exact danger Salvatore's offer was asking him to walk directly into. "If you do this," Marcus said finally, "you do it with real protection. Real documentation of your own, completely separate from anything Salvatore controls, in case this entire arrangement turns out to be less safe than he's promising. You don't just trust his word. You build your own insurance." James nodded slowly, feeling the shape of a plan finally solidify in his mind. Not just Salvatore's plan, but his own, careful and methodical the way he approached everything that actually mattered. He called Salvatore that afternoon. "I'll do it," James said. "But on my terms, not just yours." Over the following 4 months, James Callahan quietly, methodically became partner at his firm exactly as planned, and began the careful, dangerous process of documenting exactly the kind of financial records Salvatore needed, while simultaneously building his own separate insurance policy, just as Marcus had insisted. It was, by far, the most stressful period of his entire life. Every conversation with Richard Aldridge now carried a double meaning James had to carefully conceal. Every meeting with the firm's larger clients required him to notice details he'd have overlooked entirely a year earlier. Inconsistencies in invoices, unusual patterns in wire transfers, the small, careful signs of money moving through channels it was never supposed to touch. He confided in almost no one besides Marcus during this stretch, understanding clearly that his own safety depended on exactly how few people knew what he was actually doing. "I know what you're doing," Richard said the moment James arrived, voice shaking. "I've seen the access logs on the accounts you've been pulling records from. You're building something against the organization I owe money to, and if they find out I let that happen on my watch, they will kill me, James. Not threaten. Kill." James felt his pulse pounding, understanding immediately that this conversation could end his entire arrangement with Salvatore in the worst possible way. "Richard, whatever you think you know." "Don't," Richard said, holding up a shaking hand. "I'm not here to expose you. I'm here because I need out too, and I think you're the only person who might actually understand exactly how trapped I've been for the past year." His voice cracked. "Your wife wasn't just an affair to me, James. I know that doesn't make it better, but I got in so deep with these people that I started looking for any advantage I could find, and Melissa was an easy way to stay close to information about your position at the firm. I'm not proud of that. I've hated myself for it every single day since." James stood in that empty parking garage, feeling a complicated wave of fury and, unexpectedly, something almost like pity for a man who'd clearly been drowning in consequences of his own poor choices for far longer than James had understood. "What do you want from me?" James asked finally. "I want to help you finish this," Richard said. "Properly. With everything I know, not just what you've been able to piece together on your own. I think it's the only way either of us survives what happens next." With Richard's cooperation, the documentation James had spent months carefully assembling suddenly expanded into something far more complete and considerably more dangerous. detailed records not just of the money movement Salvatore had originally asked about, but of the exact pressure tactics the rival organization had used to control Richard, and by extension, parts of James's own firm, for well over a year. "This is more than I originally asked for," Salvatore said carefully, reviewing the expanded documentation James delivered, genuine surprise evident in his usually controlled voice. "This level of detail could dismantle considerably more of their operation than I initially expected." "Richard wants out too," James said. "He's willing to testify, if it comes to that, in exchange for protection." Salvatore considered this for a long moment. "That changes the shape of what I can offer both of you. Full federal protection, not just financial compensation, would require bringing in law enforcement contacts I've cultivated for exactly this kind of situation. It's more complicated, but considerably more secure for everyone involved, including you." James felt something settle in his chest at that. Not relief exactly. The situation was still enormously dangerous, but a growing sense that this entire, terrifying gamble might actually resolve into something that protected more people than just himself. Over the following weeks, working carefully with federal investigators, Salvatore quietly connected them to James and Richard, built a case detailed enough to result in a sweeping series of arrests targeting the rival organization's financial network, a case that, crucially, never once exposed Salvatore's own involvement, exactly as he'd promised from that very first phone call. James Callahan, a mid-level accountant who 6 months earlier had been focused entirely on making partner and saving his marriage, had become, almost without realizing exactly when the transformation happened, a central figure in dismantling a criminal financial network that had quietly poisoned his entire professional life without his knowledge. The $1 billion, when it finally arrived, felt almost secondary to everything else he'd survived to get there. When the promised payment finally arrived, structured carefully across several legitimate investment vehicles exactly as Salvatore had described that very first night, James found himself feeling something considerably more complicated than simple relief or excitement. "I keep waiting to feel happy about this," he admitted to Marcus over dinner, staring at numbers on a financial statement that fundamentally changed the entire trajectory of his life. "And I don't exactly. I feel like I survived something. That's different from feeling happy about it." "That makes sense," Marcus said gently. "You didn't just gain a fortune, James. You lost a marriage, discovered it was tangled up in something far darker than you understood, and spent nearly half a year quietly risking your life to help dismantle a criminal network most people would run from entirely. That's not the kind of thing that resolves into simple happiness right away." James thought about that for a long moment, turning his glass slowly on the table the way he used to turn cold coffee cups during the hardest weeks of his old life. "I think what I actually feel," he said finally, "is like I finally understand exactly what I'm capable of when everything I thought was solid gets taken away at once. I didn't fall apart. I found a way through it, even when the path forward was more dangerous than anything I'd ever faced before." "That's not nothing," Marcus said. "That might actually be more valuable than the $1 billion, even if it doesn't feel that way yet." James used a portion of that money to help Richard Aldridge start over completely under witness protection, a decision that surprised Marcus but made complete sense to James, a strange, complicated debt he felt toward a man who had, in his own deeply flawed way, ultimately chosen to help correct the damage he'd caused rather than continuing to hide from it. He used another portion to quietly fund a financial literacy program at the same community center where he'd grown up, wanting something good and permanent to come out of the wreckage of that Tuesday night, beyond just his own transformed fortune. 6 months after that first devastating phone call, Salvatore Marchetti called James one final time, his voice carrying something James hadn't heard from him before, a kind of closure, deliberate and final. "The arrests are finalized," Salvatore said. "The organization I've spent years working to dismantle has lost the majority of its financial infrastructure, thanks in no small part to the documentation you and Richard provided. I wanted you to hear that directly from me, not from a headline. Was it worth it? James asked quietly. All of it. My marriage. 6 months of looking over my shoulder. Richard having to disappear into an entirely new identity. Salvatore was quiet for a long moment. I can't answer that question honestly for you, Mr. Callahan. I can tell you that the organization we helped dismantle had spent years destroying far more lives than just yours. Quietly, the way these things always work, one manipulated relationship and one pressured debt at a time. What you helped stop protects people who will never know your name and never understand exactly what it cost you to make that possible. James sat with that answer, understanding it wasn't the clean, satisfying resolution he might have wanted 6 months earlier, sitting frozen in his own driveway with a champagne bottle in his hand. It was something more complicated and, in its own way, more honest. A reminder that some of the most important things a person does in their life come wrapped in genuine cost, not easy triumph. Thank you, James said finally, for being honest with me from that very first phone call. Even when the honesty was uncomfortable. You earned that honesty, Salvatore said. Most people in your position that night would have hung up the phone. You didn't. That took a kind of courage I don't often see, Mr. Callahan. I suspect you're going to do something meaningful with the life you've rebuilt from this. The call ended, and James sat alone in his new apartment, modest by choice, despite the fortune now sitting quietly in his accounts, feeling, for the first time in 6 exhausting months, something that finally resembled genuine peace. A year after that Tuesday evening, when he opened his own bedroom door and watched his marriage collapse in 3 unbearable seconds, James Callahan's life looked almost nothing like the one he'd been building before, and in the ways that mattered most, it was considerably more honest. He'd left the accounting firm entirely, unable to separate its walls from the 6 most dangerous, transformative months of his life, and started his own small consulting practice instead, one built on careful, transparent work he never again wanted to question the true nature of. He kept in touch with Marcus, obviously, the friend who'd talked him through the single hardest decision of his life, without ever once judging him for making it. He never spoke to Melissa again beyond the necessary logistics of their divorce, understanding finally, with hard-won clarity, that the woman he'd married and the version of events he'd believed for 6 years had never fully matched the complicated truth underneath it. Looking back at that frozen moment in his bedroom doorway, champagne bottle in hand, James understood something now that he couldn't have grasped in the raw devastation of that first terrible night. The worst moment of his life hadn't actually been an ending at all. It had been the exact, painful hinge point where an entire life he'd built on quiet, careful reliability finally cracked open wide enough to reveal what he was actually capable of when everything familiar disappeared at once. He hadn't just survived that Tuesday night. He'd walked, deliberately and with open eyes, into a decision most people would have run from, and emerged from it with a clarity about his own strength that no amount of money could have given him on its own. Some stories end with revenge. Some end with heartbreak. James Callahan's story ended somewhere more complicated and, in its own way, more true, with a man who lost everything he thought defined his life, and found, underneath the wreckage, the exact strength he needed to build something considerably more honest in its place. If James's story pulled you in the way we hope it did, take a moment right now to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need it tonight. Subscribe if you want more powerful, twist-filled emotional stories just like this one, dropping every single week. And down in the comments, tell us honestly, do you think James made the right choice that night, or would you have hung up the phone? We read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with James's story. There's another one waiting for you right now. Just click the video on your screen, and let's keep this going together.